Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. In today's episode, we'll be talking about homicide loss and the trauma resulting from this extreme kind of loss, which most often entails dealing with the court cases and the media, putting grief into the public eye. I'm joined by Katja Faber, who will be sharing her thoughts and experiences on how she as a parent dealt with the loss, the grief, the trauma, and the legal system. We also cover the topic of siblings grief and how she mothered her two living children who grieved their brother. She shares how she dealt with the media and the added pain caused by media coverage. The victims' families are often re-traumatized through ongoing trials, and she shares her feeling towards the upcoming trial. One specific point about homicide loss is how to continue living with the fact that the killer is still out there alive. And Katja points out the importance of accountability. She also shares about the various ways in which she healed and cared not just for herself, but also for her two other children grieving the loss of their brother. I've known Katja for several years, in fact since the call for contributions for my fourth book, Surviving My First Year of Child Loss, for which she contributed a chapter. Make sure and go and check it out. Serendipitously, through the process of writing the chapter, we found out that we happened to live just a few kilometers apart. Since the book came out in 2017, we have become good friends, and I have been part of some of Katja's dealings with the court and journalists. Katja's story is extraordinary and has made waves in the media worldwide. Since the recording of this episode a few weeks ago, the court case has taken place at the High Court in Zurich and the killer was convicted. We are planning to do part 2 of this interview in a few weeks, so stay tuned. So here's a short bio. Katja Faber is the mother of 3 children. Following her 23-year-old son's murder in Switzerland, she used her legal training to work closely with lawyers, the state prosecutor, to secure justice for her dead son, Alex. Through writing at Still Standing magazine and other grief-related publications, she hopes to break the taboo of homicide loss and child loss. She runs her own fruit farm and is an advocate for ecotherapy as a means of finding healing following traumatic loss. Katja is a certified compassionate bereavement care counselor through the Center for Loss and Trauma in partnership with the MISS Foundation and the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Family Trust. You can find all the links in the show notes to this podcast as well to Katja's writing and her website. So welcome, Katja. So welcome, Katja. It's so nice to have you on the podcast. How are you doing today?
Well, thank you, Natalie. I'm feeling relatively calm, and I'm up in the mountains in Switzerland at the moment, trying to stay calm. I have a hearing coming up next week, and as we talk further, people will understand why this is important to stay grounded during the next few days.
So why don't you tell us a little bit more about your story of loss and trauma?
If I go back, to before my son was killed, just to give a little bit of context for your listeners, I am a lawyer or a barrister. In England, it's called a barrister. For your American listeners, that would be the equivalent of an attorney who goes to court. And I used to specialize in criminal defense. And I give that as way of background because it does have some bearing on the way that I've dealt with what's happened in the years subsequent to my son's homicide. So my story is that in 2014, my 23-year-old son, Alex, was killed by someone he knew. It's difficult to say whether my story is a typical story of homicide loss, but I think definitely there are certain common traits in my story to many other people who suffer this type of violent loss. And I think it's important that perhaps people that haven't been touched by homicide loss gain some kind of understanding so that they can support those that are. It's difficult to explain to someone who hasn't had the horrendous experience of losing a loved one or a child through homicide loss what is actually entailed. I think the two main components are the violence and the suffering of the victim. And I think as a mother particularly, the fact that your child suffered and you weren't there in any way to alleviate that suffering or to stop it from happening is something that really causes a lot of trauma. And that part is hard. That's not to say that there aren't other types of grief that don't have that. I mean, clearly suicide incorporates certain elements of that, or accidental death if you have a car crash, that also would be true. But the problem with homicide loss is that it becomes a public grief, and it does touch on elements that have nothing to do with grief, because suddenly you're thrown into not only your personal response to how you're dealing with your loss, but a parallel system, which is the judicial system. And the difficulty with that is that even if you weren't dealing with loss, it would be extremely stressful to have to deal with the police or with prosecutors or go to court. But when you add that to actually having to deal with the death of your child, it becomes overwhelming.
Mm. Yeah. And I remember we've known each other for quite some years, and you told me a little bit about Alex's story, but even just what you told me was so intense just listening to it. And I can just guess that people who hear that story will be shocked in itself. And so I cannot even imagine the shock that it was for you as his mother.
Yes. To put it into words is impossible, really. You can try. Even for me, who was trained and has experience in speaking publicly, even just coming on this podcast, it's a very different thing if I'm going to talk about homicide loss just generally or talk about my own story. That is tough. And it's 7.5 years since it happened. And I still find it hard. I mean, certainly in the first few years, I was deeply traumatized, not only by what had happened to Alex, but the entire system, from the police to dealing with lawyers, dealing with court hearings. And this I say as a criminal defense lawyer. So I have been exposed to these forums before, was very, very stressful, very stressful. And there were times that I simply couldn't understand what was happening. Goodness knows, for somebody who has never stepped into the arena of a court, I cannot even begin to imagine how they must be feeling, because, just professionally, I knew what was going on. And even then I didn't understand what was going on.
Yeah, there's a big difference between knowing what's going on, but actually experiencing it on an emotional level. Huh?
Exactly. I think one of the things about homicide loss, there are different things that affect it. But if I could just mention the main ones for people that perhaps have no experience, or they themselves are going through it, but are completely overwhelmed and can't unravel what they're going through. Like I said, there is this difference, I think, between the element of justice and the grief, or the judicial system and the grief. Now, if you're lucky enough, and I use the word lucky in air quotes, to actually have an arrest, then a whole procedure starts taking place, and you're having to deal with court hearings and whether there's a prosecution, whether there's a verdict, whether there's parole hearings, whether there's appeals. That can go on for years. On the other hand, you may not have an arrest, and you may have to live with the fact that the person that has done this horrendous thing to your loved one or child is just walking around scot-free, and that you don't have any semblance of justice. I think the thing about justice is you don't have to go through a homicide loss to understand the concept of justice. We've all experienced that feeling of injustice. You can be in the playground as a child and somebody takes your football away and you feel it's unjust, or maybe you're at home and your sibling gets a bigger slice of cake and you feel there's an element of injustice about it. So this is a natural response to situations which all of us can understand. When it comes to actually that your loved one and your child having been killed, it's monumental. I mean, the feeling of injustice compounded by the grief is overwhelming. And I would say to those going through this and those who want to be supportive, feel the feelings. I mean, the rage and the anger that you might feel, the numbness, the shock, these are really important things to actually feel. It is normal to feel these things. It is an adaptive response. And anyone who tells you, oh, well, it's not as bad, or, it'll get better or whatever, just go your own way. And if you have to punch your pillow because you're so angry, then do so. I mean, I think one of the things that is, certainly I've written about it because, one of the ways that I expressed my grief was actually to put it down on paper. If you can get those emotions out, it allows for healthier emotions to come in. Otherwise, if you spend your time repressing that, it's going to be very tough not to be actually in trauma for years. That's my personal view.
What were the ways in which you expressed those emotions besides writing? I mean, what would you want someone else who is going through that in terms of those intense emotions? What would you like them to know how to feel them, how to express them?
Certainly from my point of view, and I know this is not for everyone, one of the main ways that I was able to channel my feelings was actually to be involved in the court case. Clearly, every single homicide case is different, but because I was a trained lawyer and also subsequently had been working as a journalist, a way of getting that feeling of impotence reduced was actually to be in contact with the prosecution, to find out what was going on, to somehow be involved in as much as I could be in the case. That helped me tremendously because I felt I was fighting for my son. So that is one side that I was able to do, and that helped me. Then there's the other side, which has more to do with self-compassion and self-help. If I can put them into sort of separate categories, one is sort of externalizing your grief and your anger and that feeling of injustice. I did it through trying to be involved in the case as much as I could be. And the other side is how to look after yourself. How do you go about dealing every day with this loss? How do you carry this trauma? And certainly, I tried several things. I think one of the things that is very important is self-care, even though you probably don't want to get up in the morning and you don't care about the world because you're in deep grief. I think if you can stay away from self-medicating, so stay away from the alcohol, which is a depressive, try and eat food that is good for you. It would be nice to say try and get sleep. I didn't sleep for about 3 years, so I'm the last person to say try and sleep, because even today I can go to bed and I'm still awake at 4 o'clock in the morning. But go for walks, go for strolls, try and get outside, take time for yourself, run a hot bath and go and cry in the bath. Take time to just be. And if you don't want to see people, and you don't want to go to a dinner, or people have said, oh, why didn't you come out? Then say no. Really, you are able to turn people down and just simply say, I don't feel up to it. I think we all have to find out where our limits are. Sometimes intellectually we may think, okay, this will do me good. It is important that I go to this lunch. I need to somehow do something other than just stay at home crying. But if at the last minute it's too much, then just say, I can't make it, or halfway through it, just excuse yourself and go home. And I think for many of us, that's actually really quite a tough thing to do, because we've been educated to be crowd pleasers. We try to keep the harmony in the family. We try to make sure that people are okay, and to suddenly put ourselves at the forefront of our own self-care is a learning process. To actually say, I'm sorry, there's no lunch today. You'll have to sort yourselves out. I really can't do with anything except just stay in bed and I don't know, listen to an audiobook or whatever it happens to be that you want to do.
You also have 2 other children besides Alex. how did you manage being a mom, staying a mom, dealing with their grief, their way of dealing with Alex's death? How did that work for you as a family?
Well, I dealt with it as well as I could. I don't think there is a right or wrong way of doing this. When Alex was killed, my daughter was then 21 years old, and I had a younger child and he was 12. So they were fully aware of what was happening. In some ways, having to look after them helped me. In other ways, it made it harder because I could see how traumatized they were. It was almost as if I had to split myself in two. I was dealing with my own feelings and my own response to the loss and the violence of what happened to Alex, at the same time as I was trying to shield my children and be supportive of their grief, and yet still expose them to the truth, because there was no point in not telling them what was happening, because they were fully aware of what was happening. You know, one of the things about homicide loss is that it becomes a public event, and that in itself creates huge re-traumatizing for the co-victims. You know, you not only have to deal with the judicial system, so you have to physically turn up at court, or have to. For many, you don't have to, but they choose to. And for some, they have to because they are actually witnesses to the event. But you also have to deal with the media. And the sad fact is that our society glamorizes violence. I mean, you can switch on any TV or Netflix or whatever it is that you want to watch, and it's just full of violence. That's the society we live in. And so when you are a part of that circus and you are being unwillingly dragged through it, you don't have the tools at your disposal to deal with that. No one's trained you how to deal with that. It's full on suddenly being exposed to newspapers, interviews, people wanting to know, well, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? And you're at your worst moment because you're in deep grief to deal with that. Plus, you don't have any training for that. I mean, I've been trained to talk publicly and represent clients in court, and I just didn't know what to say, because it's very different when you need to talk about a subject that you have knowledge about and you have researched and has nothing to do with you personally, to when they're actually talking and asking you about your child who's been killed in the most horrific way.
Yeah, and I remember from you saying that your background is also in journalism. I remember early on when we got to know each other, I accompanied you once to I think it was a journalist who was writing about you. And I can only imagine that what they're actually then going to write about what you said is different to what you feel or what you might have said or how you meant it. And then you mentioned your children as well, reading all of that.
This is one thing I would definitely say to those who are either already grieving through homicide loss or just beginning this horrific journey. Be very, very careful about the media. Very careful. They need to sell, okay? And they will write what they can get away with. And you will very rarely have editorial control as to what they're going to say. In my case, it's been relatively okay. I have very rarely found things that were published that were a distortion of the truth. But I know of many people who have had extremely difficult experiences with the media where their children were victim blamed. And I mean, that is something that does happen. Unfortunately, again, in our society, we don't like to think that, you know, homicide could happen to any of us. And so people tendency wise turn around and blame the victim, which is extraordinary. If your child's been shot, that they should be at fault for having been shot. So it is a difficult one because being in the public eye, you will be exposed to not having your own personal space invaded by people you don't know, be it in the comments section of an article or maybe people start trolling you. There have been awful cases. I mean, I can think of one particular one, for example, in the US, the Sandy Hook killings of the kindergarten children. And some of these parents were trolled mercilessly. And unfortunately, the laws regarding defamation and libel, even though they vary in different countries, if you are dead, people can say what they like about you. And that is shocking, really, because if you're alive, then you can actually turn around and say, well, that's not true. And if you so choose or have the money, you could actually sue somebody. If you're dead, you can't. That's a sharp learning curve for families that have to deal with the loss of their loved one who may be defamed. I mean, in the UK, there was a very famous case many years ago of a football stand that collapsed, the Hillsborough disaster. And the newspapers at one stage were blaming the people who were standing in this football ground for the fact that the thing had collapsed. And it took years to show that this was not the case. It is something that people need to be aware of. I don't want to cause extra stress or anxiety to those going through this, but it is worth being aware of it. And perhaps if you have this on your plate, try and find somebody who you trust in your family or your network of friends who perhaps deals with this and can deal with queries from the media so that you don't have to deal with it.
I'm guessing you had some kind of personal resources, being a lawyer yourself and having background in journalism. But what other resources have helped you deal with your grief, which is something that all these grievers listening here who might benefit from?
I mean, I think I touched on the question of self-compassion and looking after yourself. So looking after your body. I mean, at the end of the day, our body is a machine and it's basically processing the grief just as much as our mind is and our heart. I spend a lot of time in nature, and I have found that nature absolutely is a healing tool, if I can call it that. But certainly, I mean, I have a small holding, and I grow fruit trees and I grow my own vegetables, and that I found incredibly helpful, to be outside. I think the thing about nature is that we don't know how it works. We just know that it does. So whether it is going for a walk in the forest, lying underneath a tree in the park, just go out and be in nature. It's not only the fact that you probably get a bit more oxygen and you get more sunlight on your skin and you're more exposed to the elements, but actually there is something about nature that we simply do not understand. I certainly, I mean, you know, through my grief process, I've gone into this quite in depth, and I encourage everyone to explore this. That's not to say that therapy can't help. I mean, I don't want to just say, you know, being in nature is going to make you feel so much more fantastic immediately. That is not the case. I think some people can benefit from therapy, so long as you find a therapist that is grief-informed or trauma-informed. I think that's important, because if you find the wrong therapist, that can be re-traumatizing because they're telling you stuff that actually doesn't help. I think going to therapy, if that's what you think is going to be of benefit, doing things outside, because the beauty of nature is not only you can see it, and you can see the seasons, you can see how it changes, but it doesn't judge you. You know, one of the difficulties of being in grief, I certainly have found, is that when you're with people, unless they really get what you're going through, you very often are put in a situation where you have to somehow explain, or you feel misjudged, misunderstood. And you don't get that with trees or with flowers or with animals. You can just be. You can be where you are in your grief, and you're accepted. And that's important.
Another podcast guest actually said something really good, and that might apply here too. She said that we want people surrounding us to care, because understanding might not be possible. So understanding the grief, or understanding the specifics about your grief, that might be too far stretch. But we want them to care. And I'm guessing, at least speaking about animals, which I have experienced, they care no matter what.
That is
they care,
true.
we care.
I mean, you know, if you have pets, be surrounded by animals. There is a huge amount of benefit to be gained from from having an animal close by. I mean, they reduce your blood pressure, and, there are physiological changes that have been recorded. I think this thing about people caring, I mean, clearly, if you can have a support network around you that stays, that is huge. I mean, one of the reasons I haven't put it at the top of my list, if I can call it a list, because all of these things, it's not a do one and then the other. This is all happening at the same time. I am acutely aware of the fact that a lot of people don't have a support network. A lot of people not only feel alone, but they are alone. Sadly, our society is not one that encourages community. People can live in a city and they don't even know who their neighbor is. There is a lot of dysfunctional families that when a crisis like this happens, they simply aren't there for the person who is touched by the homicide. If it's possible to find supportive family members and friends, then fantastic. They are also on a learning curve. They don't know how to deal with it. Give each other the space to learn together, and you'll make mistakes. If they want to be there for you, let them. The other way of doing it is to come into contact with people that have suffered a similar loss. And this is true for anything. I mean, if you have a car accident and you have difficulty walking afterwards, then probably you're going to connect with people at the physio who are going through the same thing. And so, this is not unique to child loss or to homicide loss, but definitely there is a commonality in the experience. And if you can either meet online or personally with people who have suffered a similar loss, I would encourage you to do so. I mean, I have found it incredibly helpful. I came across the Compassionate Friends, which some of your listeners may know of. And they have dedicated Facebook groups for different types of grief. And that is very helpful because I think one of the problems with homicide loss is that there are so many different emotions and events, if I can call them that, with the judicial process that other people simply don't understand. So it's helpful to be able to talk online with those that are going through similar experiences, already have a similar experience, and give you advice how to deal with it.
Yeah, and we're going to put all these resources that you, Katja, mentioned in the show notes. So if you want to look them up, the Compassionate Friends and all these pages, they're there as links. Now, Katja, can you tell us about a time when, through whatever reasons, you didn't or couldn't or wouldn't grieve or heal, and why?
I don't think I didn't grieve at any point. That the grief felt different, that, yes. So initially, I would say that I felt numb, and it was a new experience for me. I suppose it's a form of shock, but I did feel numb. I don't think that was me not grieving. I think it was me grieving in the initial stages. I hate that word. I hasten to add stage, but in the initial phase, the initial days, months, it was my body shutting down. I mean, the best way that I can describe it for those that perhaps haven't gone through this is I felt as if I'd been skinned alive. And
oh, wow.
Anything, absolutely anything, was extremely painful on top of the pain that I was feeling. And I remember thinking at the time how I wish that the old-fashioned way of dealing with mourning in wearing black clothes was still the way that we dealt with it, because I was so fully aware. I should have had a T-shirt or a hat or something that I could have put on to warn people that I was in this terrible place. I missed that. I mean, I could have maybe put on something that gave others, whether they were in the street or at the baker's or on the train, basically notice that I was grieving. And unfortunately, nowadays, everybody wears black because it's fashionable and that's the clothes we wear and everybody's in black. So that didn't help. Not if I wore a black coat or a black shirt. That was of no help at all. And I wish there had been something that I could have told people, you know what, I'm in deep grief right now, because then at least those around you realize that you are in this process and they have to accommodate that in some way, or at least you give them notice that this is how you are experiencing that moment.
Handle
exactly.
with care.
So basically, I don't know whether that answers your question. Have I ever not grieved? I think one of the things is that because homicide loss is so complex and you're repeatedly being dragged into the public arena, there have been moments that I've had to compartmentalize, because otherwise you just can't deal with it, or you deal with it less well. There are moments when, for example, if I am at court or if I'm having to deal with somebody who is not interested in my personal journey but is interested in the case, that I have to put on a mask and just put my personal feelings just to the side. But I'm very, very aware of that. And I think that is important. If you have to do that, to be aware of the fact that you're doing it, and then to take the mask off, that it doesn't become the way that you deal and interact with the world.
I mean, over the years, I've seen you sharing a lot on Instagram and in your writings, and we haven't really spoken about that. If you mentioned it briefly that you've written about it, but I think that's really a place where I see you really processing what's going on. Would you like to talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. I think everybody can write. I don't mean that they have to write reams, but I think everybody has the potential to put their feelings down on paper. And I think that is a good thing. Some people might find it more helpful than others, but I think because it's a private thing, if you keep a journal, if you have thoughts going around in your mind, pop them down on a piece of paper, write into your computer, speak into your telephone. I think that is helpful. You get it out. I mean, when I go for walks in the woods, I talk to myself. So if somebody comes across me, they probably think I'm slightly mad, but I do actually have conversations with myself. And I feel so much better for it afterwards. But you're right. I mean, one of the things that I have done is write. And I'm a writer by nature, in fact, and I love writing. So for me, that was a natural go-to. And I have published a certain amount of things, or had published, which is also helpful in the sense that being able to express what you feel and in some way helping others through your own experience is a positive experience. But certainly, I think if you can write about it, do so. And you may find it helpful then looking back, reading how you felt maybe a year before, 2 years before, can help on some level to see how far you've come and how you are dealing with things. That's certainly my experience.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned in the beginning that in a week's time from recording this, you have another court case coming up, and you had a few of those happening in the past, and to one of them I actually was present. How do you feel about that coming up?
As anyone who is involved in a legal case will tell you, you have to be very careful about what you say. So I can't and won't talk about the actual case. I wouldn't want to jeopardize the proceedings. So I'm just going to leave that to one side. How I'm feeling and how I'm dealing with it. You know, Natalie, it's basically 7.5 years since my son was killed, and we're still dealing with this. Unfortunately, the judicial systems of the world are not fit for purpose. They're creaking. They're underfunded, there are too many cases. There's a whole set of reasons why they just don't work. In some countries, you have the added component of corruption. And there are many people that I've come across through my writing, and they've reached out and they've written to me and they've said, how shall I deal with this? What can I do? They're dealing with cases where the case is either thrown out of court, where money clearly has exchanged hands. And that's very hard to have to go through that and realize that there are proceedings that are distorted because somebody is not doing their job properly, either at the police level or at the judicial level. I'm relatively lucky. The court case is in Switzerland. That's not to say that there aren't problems here. Like any other judicial system, there are problems. But there is a clear process in place. I think it's appalling that co-victims or the families of a homicide victim have to go through this again and again and again. Mm-hmm. And it is re-traumatizing. You get to a point in your grief where you can function and you can start to enjoy moments of your life. You can go maybe out to dinner and meet friends and actually have a good evening and go home. You're still grieving, but you're starting to make steps in rebuilding your life. And then you have to go straight back into the horror and be in a public arena and again have to see the killer of your child sitting there and the judges and the lawyers and the media. And so it is re-traumatizing. And that's a part that people, I don't think, fully appreciate, because so often in the newspapers you hear, oh, well, there was a conviction. Hooray, this person's been put in jail or something. And then people think that's it. And what they don't realize is that the family, it's just only beginning, really. They've just been through a trial, and now they're going to have a whole appeal process, because the chances are that the lawyers will want to appeal. And then even if the appeal goes ahead, then probably there's a parole hearing, or then there will be the moment that your child's belongings are given back to you in a box, because now finally the trial is over. Would you like the clothes with the blood on them? Would you like only the watch they were wearing? All of this kind of stuff. People just don't have any concept of how awful it is, because just as you're beginning to step towards a semblance of what could be the rest of your life, you're dragged back and you're having to deal with these things. So yes, so I'm trying to be Zen-like at the moment. I'm attempting to stay grounded, and I am accepting of whatever comes. I know that there is very little I can do to determine the outcome of this, and I wish to be okay with it, if for no other reason that I owe it to myself and I owe it to my still living children and those that care about me, because they have a right to have a full and beautiful life. And having a mother that's traumatized and overwhelmed by something that she has no control over is not doing anybody any favors. So I am actively trying to stay sane, if I can put it that way. I don't know whether that answers your question, but it is stressful. It is stressful. And I have to say, I wish I wasn't having to go back to court and I didn't have to face this, but I do. So yeah, that's what it is.
Definitely. This was a touching answer, how you put the two sides, that you have to write to be sane or to go towards that. And at the same time, this is still going on. It's like a paradox of two things, and they're equally here right now, right? You, your children, and that. It's all here, and what to do with it.
And just to add, I've talked about the judicial process, but the fact is that if your loved one or your child dies in circumstances where there is another human being involved, be it homicide or some kind of accidental death or negligent cause, you will always be dealing with that external component, which is the person who caused the death. And that is something that is hard, because accountability is a big part of processing what you're going through. Holding somebody accountable, being able to say, you were the reason why my life has just turned around and you are still here and the person I love or my child isn't. And that's why, there is a lot that's written about forgiveness. That's a whole other subject. I take the slightly more pragmatic legal approach, which is holding somebody accountable is important. How you then deal with it internally, that's a very private matter. But actually seeing that the person that caused the death actually had to answer for it. And that is hugely important in homicide loss. I don't say it's not important if there's been a car crash or there's been a fire where you work and it was the fault of the company because they didn't have the right safety measures or something. I mean, I think there are many other different types of holding somebody accountable, but I think it is important. And when you don't get that, either because the person isn't prosecuted or because the person is found not guilty, or for whatever reason, it's hard because you have to come to terms, ideally at some point, with the fact that there will be no justice, if justice is even a concept, if I can put it that way. Justice is different for everyone. And so that's one of the issues with homicide loss. No matter what happens in court, I will still know that Alex's killer is out there. That is just how it is. And there will be times when I wonder, well, what's he doing? How is he doing? And for a lot of families that have dealt with this, they have the added horror that the person who was to blame for their child's death goes and does it again. It is a highly complex grief because of this public element, and knowing that the person who killed your child is possibly out there. And sometimes they're not. Sometimes they kill themselves. You have these homicide, suicide cases, and then there's no accountability. You can't even ask them. You don't understand. There are so many questions that are left unanswered, which unfortunately you have to find a way of coping and carrying for the rest of your life.
Well, Katja, you've given us a lot of insight into a very complex and difficult loss situation of homicide loss. So thank you so much for all the insight that you shared in this complex topic. And so I'm going to end this with the rapid fire questions, the sentences that I ask to finish each and every one of my podcast guests. Are you ready? So this is just a simple finishing a sentence, finishing a statement. Grieving and trauma means?
Heartbreak.
Healing means?
Acceptance.
What I have learned about myself in the light of loss and trauma?
I'm a tough cookie.
One thing I wish people knew about loss and trauma?
It happens to everyone, and it's a human experience. Other animals have it as well. It is a part of what it means to be alive and to love.
And the last one specific thing that has changed since my loss and trauma that I wouldn't want to miss is?
Okay, given that I would rather not have gone through this experience at all, and I would rather undo all the learning process that I've had, because clearly I would rather have my son, I have no choice in the matter. Something that I can say has enhanced my life experience. I would say my take on life generally, the arc of life. I am less self-invested and I look at the world in a more macro way, perhaps. I take myself more out of it and look at it with more perspective, perhaps. It's probably also an age question. I mean, like it is not, it is now 7.5 years. So unfortunately, I've got more grey hairs and my knees creak. So I have learned more about life generally, but I think it's fast forwarded the knowledge that I probably would have gained. So maybe not, but maybe what I would have known at the age of 80, I have learned in the space of these years. So that's possibly, I don't want to use the word wise, because that again presupposes certain understandings, but I think I have a deeper understanding of what it means to be alive and conscious on this planet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Katja, for your time here and wishing you all the best with the upcoming proceedings.
Thank you so much, Natalie. It's been delightful, if I can put it that way, and an honor to be able to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.